Open up your Bibles, if you would, to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel's in the Old Testament. If you're still learning your way around the Bible, there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. The Old Testament's first. It starts with Genesis. And 1 Samuel's like the ninth book of the Old Testament, ninth book of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel. Now, we started a series a few weeks ago. This will be our last week on it, talking about the way our mind thinks. We call it mind games, because for so many of us, well, probably all of us, in some form or fashion, we have strongholds that battle us. I mean, and they're connected and created by different things. They could be created by our past, by failures or things that we've done. We haven't navigated through those things, by things that have been done to us. Sometimes it's been done by people that are in our lives and that type of things. One of the things I'm going to talk to you about this morning is fear. Fear creates tremendous strongholds in our life. And when I say a stronghold, so many times there's just this conversation that takes place in our mind as we see things, as we hear things, as we interact with different people, as we have conversations, that there's this ongoing narrative up here. And sometimes the things that conversation has is right. It's what God would have us say. And sometimes it's not correct, but we still embrace it and treat it as if it's the truth in our life. And so those are the things I want to confront, because God has so much more for us than most of us are living. His plan is so much bigger than most of us have dared to embrace or dared to walk through. Now, in saying that, I'm not saying that there won't be challenging times. I'm not saying that we won't go through hardship. I'm not saying that we won't have to overcome some things, that we won't have some setbacks and that type of thing. But for all of us, God has something for us. You know, for any of us that have walked with God for any period of time, we probably have had seasons where we're really connected to what He's called us to do. We're really doing those things. And there's a challenge with that. We endure some persecution, some misunderstanding, some criticism. But we also bear the most fruit in those seasons. And sometimes because of disappointment or because of just whatever reason, distraction or whatever, we can step back and we don't face near the persecution, but we also don't see near the fruit. And so, we want to push past all those things. So we want to look at fear, how fear's voice impacts us. And one of the people that I told you we would look at quite a bit is David with his battle with Goliath, because there's so many things he deals with here. So we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel 17, verse 37. And so, as you remember, for those of you that have heard this before, that Goliath was an enemy to the children of Israel. He was with a group of people called the Philistines, and they were constantly battling the children of Israel. And he was this battle-hardened soldier. He was a giant. And so, there was just a great deal of fear struck in the hearts of the children of Israel. So, in verse 37, it says, David is talking to King Saul, and he said, "The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine." Saul finally consented. "All right, go ahead," he said, "and may the Lord be with you." Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet, and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped a sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. "I can't go in these," he protested to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off again. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. "Am I a dog," he roared at David, "that you come at me with a stick?" And he cursed David by the names of his gods. "Come over here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals," Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head, and then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." I cannot help but read this, and my testosterone not just like rise through the roof right here. You're like, it's pretty graphic. Well, I mean, there's no polite way to kill somebody with a sword. I'm just telling you that right now. And so, we see this, and as you look at this and you think that fear, it has many voices. One is a subtle voice. And it's kind of that subtle voice that tells you that, you can't do it. David, he first dealt with his brothers, and his oldest brother said, well, I know why you're here. I know the naughtiness of your heart. That your motives are all wrong. So it was this real subtle voice. And then Saul, he pushed past that. David pushed past that, and he went to Saul, and Saul said, from an experience standpoint, you don't measure up. This guy's been a warrior since his youth. In other words, Goliath had a reputation. It wasn't just his size that brought fear into the hearts of the children of Israel. It was the fact that he had a reputation out there. People had heard about him and heard what he did in battle. And David didn't have that kind of experience. And Saul said, he's been a warrior since his youth, and you're but a youth. And then when he pushed past that, then Saul said, well, you don't have the right equipment. And so he didn't put on his equipment, and David took a couple of steps. He's like, I can't fight in these. And I'm sure Saul thought, well, when we fight, this is what we wear. But David didn't put that on. So a lot of times we read through these stories, and because we know the end from the beginning, it loses some of its impact. So I try to think about this. I try to think about what it would look like. And you think about this, that I imagine they were down in this valley where the battle was taking place, and the children of Israel, the army of Israel were on one side, and the army of the Philistines were on the other. And as they get in this valley, and there's this shepherd boy, and all he has on is a shepherd's robe, a staff, and a sling. And out comes this huge warrior with this reputation. I would imagine this booming voice that's fearful and intimidating. And he had a shield bearer in front of him, looking like he's ready to fight. And then fear tries to deal with us subtly at first, and then a little bit louder. But whenever we're ready to make that step, then all of a sudden fear becomes a bully. And it begins to push back against us, and it begins to challenge us, and it begins to paint a negative picture of what our future could look like. But that voice in our head that says that if you step out, if you do this, then your future is going to take a negative step in that direction. Now, I don't know that it happened this way, but I imagine it was pretty close to this, that when they're fighting, I can imagine that on the children of Israel's side, somebody could look down there and go, this is the guy that's representing us? He doesn't even have any armor on. And somebody looking and going, hey, dude, isn't that your brother? And he goes, yeah, I mean, he's always had a big mouth. I don't know. He's always mouthing off to me at home and all that kind of stuff. And now his mouth is taking him too far. I don't know what we're going to tell Dad. And then, on the other side, they're like, this is a slam dunk, man. Goliath's going to win. And I can imagine when he went, and released it, and it hit Goliath in the head, and he fell down. I just think for a minute, there was just this moment of silence, this hush across the valley. And everybody kind of looking in. And David runs up, and he doesn't have a sword of his own. I would imagine he stood on top of Goliath's chest, took the sword out, and went, and I know this is graphic, but it's what happened historically. He picked up the head and turned around and went like that to the children of Israel. And I imagine that all of a sudden, that just there was a shout that took place on both sides. One was a shout of courage, and the other was a shout of fear, and they began to run after the Philistines. And David gives us a great example when we push past fear and it begins to confront us. As fear began to talk to him, do you know what his response was? He talked back to fear. So many times that in here, that when we look at our future, that fear tries to subtly paint a picture in us and tries to tell us we can't do it. But then as time goes on, as we get closer, then fear begins to confront us with, do you know what you stand to lose? Do you know what this will cost you if you do this? Do you know what's going to take place if this happens? If you go forward, you're safe now. Stay where you are. There's no risk in staying where you are. There's a risk in getting out there. There's a risk in pushing past. And when we think about this, sometimes we think about our dreams and all that kind of things. Sometimes fear is even in those things that, sometimes even like being the first to apologize. Have you ever had that situation before? It's like, I'm not apologizing. I always apologize. If I keep apologizing, they're going to take advantage of me. And fear begins to say, you're going to live a future of just being a doormat if you're always one that apologizes. And then if you step out and push past fear, and all of a sudden your humility opens up the door for God to restore something that you thought was lost a long time ago. Fear has this voice that pushes against us, that paints a picture of our future, that doesn't look victorious at all. It doesn't look like anything could be restored. And yet it's amazing when we push past it, that on the other side of our fear, we begin to recognize God's plan and purpose for our lives. I know all of you in here, from one time or another, God has spoken to you about something. that he's given you something that he wants to do in your life, or he wants to use you through. And in that with that voice of fear as it comes out, that for every time that you begin to take that step forward, that at first it's subtle, but then it begins to talk to you. Let me ask you this question. When's the last time you spoke to fear? I know when the last time fear spoke to you, probably within the last day, maybe even this morning, as you were thinking about what you were going to do and the direction you're going to go, that fear's voice has spoken to you. But when's the last time you stopped, stood your ground, and looked at fear and spoke back to it and said, you come at me with this, but I come at you with the purpose and plan of God, with him on my side, and that's the direction I'll go. It's amazing whenever we begin to speak back to fear, how it emboldens us, how it empowers us, how it strengthens us, how it gives us courage to move forward. Because it's no longer me. Whenever fear speaks, it told David, you can't do it because you don't have the resources. You can't do it because you don't have the experience. You can't do it because you don't have the relationships, because you don't have the weaponry. And David said, I'm not coming at you with any of those things. I'm coming at you in the name of the Lord my God. And so whenever we go forward with that, then it gives us permission and the ability to push through fear and push past it. Number one, if you're taking notes, is that fear looks for a reason to disqualify you. It looks for a reason to tell you that somebody else could do this, but not you. This could happen in somebody else's life, but not yours. I've told you before that when I was going into ministry, that one of the things that held me back for so long was my imperfections. Nobody knows the areas I need to grow in more than me. Right. Nobody knows the times that I've created pain in somebody else's life because of my own immaturity, because of my own selfishness, because of the fact that I'm not to the place I need to be yet. Nobody knows that better than me. And because it is such a personal thing with me for the longest time, I let it hold me back, never realizing that God knew that I was an imperfect vessel whenever he called me. And part of the fear that I have to push through is the fear of my imperfection being the thing that disqualifies me. And so as you push past that fear and realize that it is the grace of God that has called you, it's the grace of God that stands. Others of you, the thing that's held you back or disqualified you is the pain of disappointment when you have stepped out. That fear tells you if you step out, you're going to be hurt again. You're going to be disappointed again. People are going to take advantage of you again. People aren't going to appreciate you again. Do you really want to step into that battle again? And the truth of the matter is that you will experience all of those things, but you also know from experience that the place that you experience the most fruit is when you push through fear and be willing to endure the battle. Yeah, that's good. And so fear tries to disqualify us, and that's the very first place that the voice of fear starts. Let's look at number 2. Go with me, if you would, to Joshua chapter 1. Joshua's in the Old Testament still. It's a few books before 1 Samuel, so it's like the 6th book of the Old Testament. Joshua chapter 1. Now, Joshua was a guy in the Old Testament that he was Moses' assistant. Many of you have heard of Moses. Moses was the guy that God used to lead the children of Israel out of slavery. They'd been in slavery for hundreds of years. And so in the slavery, they had they'd suffered, and so God raises up Moses, and Moses is God's mouthpiece, God's voice, God's hand, that he's the one that God uses. So for years he's this. Well, eventually he passes away, and Joshua was kind of his assistant. And so you can imagine being the guy that's got to replace Moses. I know this is going to surprise you guys, and I'm going to use a sports analogy here. But years ago, there was a guy named Steve Spurrier that coached at the University of Florida. And I'm not a Gator fan by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a good coach. And I remember when he stepped down and they asked somebody, they said, don't you want to replace Steve Spurrier? And he said, no, I don't want to replace Steve Spurrier. I want to be the guy that replaces the guy that replaced Steve Spurrier. Because he knew this, that replacing a legend is one of the hardest things you could do. Well, there's no guy more legendary in the history of Israel until Jesus than Moses. And so Joshua's going to have to replace him. And I would imagine all of these comparison voices were speaking to him. Well, hey, you're not Moses. You know, Moses did this. Moses is this. Moses is going to be this. And there's just something about that voice of comparison. And again, it's such a subtle thing. It's such a subtle thing because the things that it says are often often true. They're not incorrect. Like, in other words, if it says, I remember when I first got into student ministry, and I would look at other youth ministers, and this voice of comparing would say, well, you can't sing like they can. And I was like, well, if there were ever truer words spoken, those words are true. And then it came back and it said, you don't have cool hair like they do. And I'm like, thank you. That's true. We just stop with I don't have hair. And so, I mean, we had just one voice after another trying to compare me to other people, to contemporaries I saw, saying, you can't be that because you don't have this. We lose sight of this, that God brought us into the earth as originals, and yet most of us spend the rest of our life trying to be a copy. And the truth of the matter is that God has called us to be who we are. He wants to use us just as we are. In Joshua chapter 1, it says this: after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant. He said, Moses, my servant, is dead. In other words, he's gone now. It's your turn. It's your turn. Moses, my servant, is dead. Therefore, the time has come for you to lead these people, the Israelites, across the Jordan River into the land I'm giving them. I promise you what I promised Moses. Wherever you set foot, you will be on land I have given you. From the Negev wilderness in the south to the Lebanon mountains in the north. From the Euphrates River in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, including all the land of the Hittites. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live, for I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will be with you I will not fail you or abandon you. Be strong and courageous. Why? For you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swear to their ancestors I would give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the instructions Moses gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the right or to the left. Then you will be successful in everything you do. So God starts out this conversation with Joshua, and he basically said, Moses is dead. In other words, he's no longer the leader. Joshua, you are. And just like I was with him, I'll be with you. In other words, the thing that caused him to stand out was not what he could do, it was who he was with. And so many times we look at our own gifts and we try to limit ourselves because we don't have the resources, because we don't have the relationship. And especially when we begin to compare ourselves to other people. You know, I know that in a huge part of my life, there were many years in ministry that anybody's been around me, and actually you don't have to be around me, it's pretty obvious from a distance. I'm not really organized. I mean, when you walk in my office, I'll meet with somebody, one of the first things I'll say is like, hey, look, if messes make you nervous, you probably need to take a Xanax before you walk in here. And so, I mean, it's just you walk in my office, it's kind of messy, and I know, man, for some people that twists them, but I need people, it does, man. I need people around me that are organized. I used to view them as a threat because I would compare my gift to theirs instead of realizing that God has called me to be who I am and he's called them to be who they are. You know, I know when we first started the church and throughout the years of the church, I think about David and Jamie, and Jamie Brace, man, she's like the organized queen. And so, for her to be my friend and still tolerate my lack of organization, I'm sure there's many nights that she went to bed with a twisted stomach and said to David, why do we go to this church again? And so, but here's the thing is that God has put those people around me. But for years, I would look at somebody with that gift and think, because I can't do that, then I'm disqualified. And yet, God reminded me that they are a gift, that he's put in my life to enable me to do what he's called me to do, just like I'm put in their life to help enable them to what they've been called to do. He's called us together. And so for all of us, that this fear of comparison, some of you have heard it growing up. You've been compared with a sibling. Maybe somebody said, well, you'll never be your brother. You know what? They're right. You weren't created to be your brother. You're created to be you. You'll never be your sister. They're right. You weren't created to be your sister. You were created to be who God's made you to be. Ephesians 2:10 says we're his masterpiece. And as I said before, we're created an original, but we spend our life spending most of our time trying to die to be a copy. You were created to be who God created you to be. And God told Joshua, he said, Moses is dead. I'm calling you. I'm calling you. And I'm sure that voice went through Joshua's head. Well, man, Moses, there were 10 plagues. I mean, Moses was the guy that, that he struck the rock and water came out. Moses is the guy that, that he pronounced judgment upon the nation of Egypt and all that kind of stuff. How could God use me? And yet God said, just like I was with Moses, I'm going to be with you. And no matter who you compare yourself with, the God's made you unique. And as long as you walk in his presence and realize that whatever he's called you to do, that you need him to do it, then that's enough to cause you to step forward and begin to watch God prepare you and develop you for what he has for you. Don't let comparison limit you. Don't let comparison be the thing that stops you and tells you that you're not enough, that you don't measure up. So many times it does, and that voice of fear that whenever we look around, and the problem is that with this voice, we hardly ever tell anybody this, that, well, I think I could, but I see so-and-so and how they do things, and I could never be them. We hardly ever tell anybody. That's this secret battle that takes place. It's a secret battle that takes place up here. And sometimes we're not even aware that it's a battle. We're just so used to living with that voice of comparison that we're not even aware that it's a real fight taking place. And because we're not aware that it's a fight taking place, we don't fight back. I want to awaken in each one of us that voice that compares you to somebody else and uses that to disqualify you, that uses that to keep you away from the plan of God. Know this, that voice is not your friend. That voice is an enemy that has to be confronted and has to realize that whoever God has called you to be, in spite of the people that He's put around us, that we can learn from and that we can work together and that type of thing, it doesn't change the fact that God's going to use you. Uniquely, specifically you. And you are His gift to humanity and what He's called you to do. I'm so glad when I look at the life of Joshua that he didn't limit himself and say, I could never be Moses. He was right. He couldn't be. I could never do what God has called Moses to do. He was right because he wasn't called to do what Moses did. But God did have a call in his life that was unique to what he was called to do. And this comparison thing that holds us back, that makes us feel inadequate, it's one of the very things that the devil did in the Garden of Eden when he said to Eve, and he said that, he's saying to Eve and basically to Adam as well, that that you'll be like God if you, in other words, comparison began way back then. That who God has made you is not enough. That He's shortchanged you and short-circuited. That's the lie that He tells each one of us. That's fear trying to get in the way, telling us that we're not enough. And so just like with David, whenever fear started out subtly, but then all of a sudden, the closer he got to his destiny and to his purpose, fear began to be louder and began to threaten him about his future. That if you take this step, your future will change. And he had to confront fear and speak to it. That the fear of comparison, it's much more subtle. It's much more behind the scenes. It's much more this voice that gnaws at us, that's constantly challenging us. Let me ask you this question. Who do you compare yourself to? Who do you look at that's been in your life and in your world, and whenever you see them and what they do and how God uses them, you're constantly letting that be a reminder that you feel like you're not enough? It's a trap. It's a trap to hold you in place, to keep you away. It's trapped you to keep you away from the purpose and destiny of God. Number two is that fear takes you to the trap of comparison. Let's look at number 3 and we'll close with this. Go with me, if you would, to Matthew 14. Matthew's in the New Testament. Now, if I had an Old Testament incident that was probably my favorite, it would be David and Goliath. A New Testament kind of thing with Jesus, this may be it right here. Matthew 14, verse 24. Matthew's the first book in the New Testament. And it says this, meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified in their fear. Everybody say in their fear. In their fear. They cried out, it's a ghost. So listen to this now. Again, we know the end from the beginning, but just imagine, put yourself in the moment. And some of these guys were fishermen, so they were professionals when it came to dealing with, treacherous waters. Now, I've been out on the lake before, whenever kind of a storm kind of comes up or whatever, and you don't want to be caught out there, but every now and then one will just kind of sneak up on you. When I was a kid, I remember we'd have that happen a time or two, and it's kind of scary. I can imagine being in the situation they were in, and it happens. And so these guys are professionals, and when it's so treacherous that they're afraid, it's treacherous. Like when the professionals and the experts are in fear, that's when it's scary. And so that's where they were. And so they're out here, and it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, and they see this figure out on the water. And they're like, hey, I can imagine one of the officers go, man, this storm is it's about to sink the boat. Could it get any worse? And somebody goes, I think it just did. There's a ghost out there. So they're looking out there, and can you imagine? It's like, man, no, I'm not hungry, thank you. So anyway, they see that coming, and they go, it's a ghost out there. And Jesus responds this way. He says, but Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid, he said, take courage, I am here. Then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. Now think about this for a minute. Now, this is a real moment of fear. You got all these other disciples, and they're rowing, praying, doing whatever they can, screaming at the ghosts. And Peter is the one that steps over the side of the boat, gets out on the water, and begins to walk. In other words, he pushes past his fear. Yeah. But you've probably noticed this before, is just because you start doesn't mean that fear stops. Have you noticed that? That you begin to walk, you begin to press forward. It's not like all of a sudden fear says, well, I'm done with them, I'm going to quit talking. I've noticed that many times when I push and I make that beginning, fear continues to gnaw at me. And even when we begin to see things happen, fear begins to say, well, things are going good now, but it's not going to last. Things are going good now, but you just wait. Your future doesn't look good. And fear will begin to speak to you about what your future looks like. It'll begin to tell you that you may have started, but you're not going to finish. Your best days are right now. Your best days, they're getting ready to come to an end. And now you're going to see failure and defeat. You're going to see all these things take place. And so Peter gets out on the water and he begins to walk. And fear keeps gnawing at him. And this is what happens to him. He says, take courage. Jesus spoke to him once. Don't be afraid. He said, take courage. I am here. Then Peter called him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind, after he'd already started walking, when he saw the strong wind and the waves, after he'd already started walking. In other words, they didn't just show up. They continued on. Continued trying to intimidate him. Continued trying to tell him he was going to fail. He was terrified and began to sink. Now, I think this is interesting that if you've ever jumped in the water, you don't begin to sink when you jump in the water. Right? When you jump in the water, you just go down, right? Right? It's what happens to me, even with all my buoyancy. I just go in the water, okay? And so, but for him, it says he began to sink. It was kind of like he walks around and he kind of begins to sink as he's going down. And he realizes, oh my gosh, it's up to my waist. And so he yells out this, says he began to sink. And he said, save me, Lord, he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? Now, I pointed out this before, but I think it's interesting that if I would have been Peter, the storm is still going on. And I wish that Jesus would have said, well, let's stop the storm and let's get you back in the boat. But Jesus grabbed hold of him and they walked back to the boat. And if you read the rest of the story, you'll see that the storm didn't stop till they got back in the boat. But right here to see this, that in Peter's life, that he pushed past the fear of beginning. But he had to keep his eyes on the promise of God and on what God had called him to do and who God had called him to be. And because fear never gave up. It didn't relent in its attack on his qualification, on how he would finish, and on the fruit that he would bear. And for some of you, you've had that moment of beginning where you stepped out and you saw great things happen, but the battle was so intense. That the wounds that you bore through the battle were so real that you're almost kind of like unprepared for it. That you didn't know it was going to take place like this. I know I've shared with you that we lived in New Mexico for 17 years before we moved back here. And we were going to build our youth facility, the church that we were at. We were having such grace in our youth ministry. Hundreds of teenagers were showing up every Wednesday night. And I remember the Lord spoke to the pastor and he said, look, we're going to build a youth facility before we build any of the rest of the building, just because that's where the favor of God is at the time. And I was so excited. And I thought, man, we're going to impact the area and people are going to be just so thrilled and that type of thing. And I'll be real transparent with you. And what should have been the greatest moment in my period of youth ministry was actually the hardest. It was a time that I came the closest to quitting because I experienced so much persecution, especially from other churches, in their fear and insecurity. And there were times as we would go through it, I thought, man, this isn't worth it. Let's just reach 20 kids again. Nobody cared when we reached 20 kids. Nobody gave a rip when we had 30 kids showing up. We got 300 or 400 kids showing up a week, and now all of a sudden, not only do we have God's attention, the people's attention, we got the devil's attention too. Right. And so many times when we step out and we push through fear, that fear begins to push back. And if we don't keep our eyes on the promise of God, and we don't keep our eyes on Jesus and where he's called us to go and who he's called us to be, that fear can cause us to quit. Maybe some of you have experienced that. But because you started well, you got in the middle of it, And as you continued going, you got the devil's attention. He began to use individual situations, circumstances to push back against you, and it caused you to pull back, and you found yourself back in the boat. Maybe it's time for you to step back over the side. We walk around in this stronghold of fear, constantly telling us, you're not enough. Constantly disqualifying us, you can't do that. Constantly comparing us, well, you're not like them. Constantly saying, well, hey, you've gotten started, but you won't finish because there's just a lot of rough things up ahead. And again, oftentimes it's so subtle. Every now and then it's a booming voice of a bully, but sometimes it's just subtle. But as we begin to speak back to it and press forward with our eyes on Jesus, declaring the promise of God and declaring what faith paints our future as, then it gives us the courage to keep going. I want to speak to those of you that have stepped back in the boat for just a moment. And I want to challenge you to get your eyes off of the waves for this minute and begin to look back towards what Jesus has told you to do. I want to speak to those of you that haven't made a start yet. And Goliath is in front of you telling you that your future is going to be horrible if you leave the confines of what you know. If you leave the confines of what you're used to, of your normal. That if you dare step into the unknown of the promise of God, that it won't go well with you. And then those of you that have been told that you won't finish, well, you're not enough. To push past that voice, because on the other side of your fear is when you recognize what the next thing is that God has for you. But you have to be willing to push past that. I want you to do this. I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes for just a minute.